He was naked from the waist up, just watering his lawn, when 5 squad cars swarmed in like he'd triggered a bomb. Neighbors watched, phones out, saying nothing. He kept yelling, "This is my house," but the cuffs still clicked. The officer whispered, "Then why'd the HOA say you broke in?" And as he's shoved into the back seat, one question hangs in the air. Who really called and why did they lie? Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The sunlight dappled the surface of the infinity pool like a moving painting. The breeze was soft, the kind that carried birdsong and faint notes of jasmine from the nearby hedgerows. Brandon Keyes leaned back, in a teak lounge chair, a chilled glass of green juice resting by his side. His phone sat face down, untouched. For once, he wasn't CEO of Nextdyne Technologies or the keynote speaker for tomorrow's Diversity Summit. Today, he was just a man, a black man, enjoying a rare moment of peace. The silence was almost surreal. His newly built estate stood on 2 acres, at the edge of an exclusive Atlanta suburb. Marble floors, automated everything, and a pool that wrapped like a moat around the back patio. A personal oasis, the American dream, branded in success. He closed his eyes, but beneath that calm, Brandon carried a memory most neighbors here couldn't imagine. He saw it again, the cracked leather seats of his '95 Honda Accord, the back seat where he'd once slept for a week straight, during college. Rain tapping the windshield, like judgment. Hungry, humiliated, determined. He saw his mother Teresa Keyes, working double shifts at a South Memphis nursing home, always smelling of ammonia and lavender. Her voice haunted him still. "Make them see you, baby. Even if they don't want to." Brandon made them see him. First with a scholarship to Georgia Tech. Then by building Nextdyne, a real-time analytics company that started in his garage and now grossed 9 figures annually. He'd been profiled by Forbes, spoke at MIT, and even shook hands with the president. Still, in this moment of calm, chest bare, skin glistening from the pool, not a soul around, Brandon felt most like himself. Then something shifted. It was the kind of shift you didn't hear, but felt, like an unseen breath suddenly present behind your ear. Brandon's brow furrowed as he turned toward the perimeter hedges. There, just behind a camellia bush, stood a woman with short silver blonde hair, crisp linen slacks, and pursed lips folded tighter than a banker's handshake. She didn't blink. She just stared. Karen Delaney. He recognized her from a distance. Head of the HOA, self-appointed guardian of suburban order, and the kind of woman who made a complaint if your recycling bin was an inch off the curb. Brandon had nodded at her a few times at the community center. She'd never returned the courtesy. Now she was squinting through the hedge like she'd spotted a burglar. Brandon sat up. Slowly, confused. Karen didn't wave. Didn't speak. Instead, she raised a sleek iPhone to her ear and turned away. In the 911 call recording that would later circulate online, Karen's voice remained calm. Too calm. "Yes, hi. I need to report a suspicious individual. African-American male. Mid-30s. Shirtless. Possibly casing a property near the south end of Willow Bend Estates. Yes, he's by the pool. Looks like he doesn't belong." The call lasted 91 seconds. 6 minutes later, the sirens came. Brandon heard them before he saw the flashing lights. A cold blade of confusion sliced through his gut. From the moment the wailing sound echoed off his stone walls, something deep inside him shifted. A survival instinct. Then, shouting, "Police! Step away from the pool. Keep your hands visible." He stood quickly, hands up instinctively. 2 officers barreled through the side gate, one with his firearm drawn, the other gripping his belt, eyes darting. Brandon's heartbeat pounded against his ribs. "This is my home," he said, voice firm but calm. No response. The first officer scanned the yard with predator focus. The second took out a small black notebook. "Sir, we received a report of trespassing in progress. I need you to stay right there." Brandon blinked. "This is my property. My name's Brandon Keyes. I own this house." The officer didn't look up. "Do you have identification on you?" "I'm in swim trunks. My wallet is inside." That was the moment he saw Karen again, now standing further back with her arms crossed, watching like a queen overseeing a game of chess. Brandon tried again, more forceful now. "Go inside, check the deed, Google my name. I'm the owner here." The first officer's eyes narrowed. "This your place? Prove it." Brandon's throat went dry. I just told you. Step toward me. Slowly. Hands where I can see them. He couldn't believe it. Somewhere in the back of his mind, he remembered telling his teenage nephews how to act around police. Calm, clear, compliant. Now here he was, living the very thing he'd tried to shield them from. And then the shift came again. The officer's hand moved, not toward his gun this time, but toward his taser. A yellow glint caught in the sun. Brandon felt the tension electrify the air. He froze. He'd complied. He'd spoken respectfully. He was in his own yard. Still, the threat now pulsed inches away. The other officer, the one with the notepad, stepped forward, breaking the standoff. Let's confirm his ID before anything else, he said. But even his voice trembled under the weight of assumption. Brandon couldn't move, couldn't breathe, not because of what might happen to him, but because behind the glass patio door he saw a small face. His daughter, Ari, 8 years old. Brown curls, pajamas still on, clutching her stuffed lion. She'd seen the flashing lights. She was watching this unfold. Watching her father treated like an intruder. A threat. Less than. And Brandon could do nothing but stand there, hands up, waiting to prove he had the right to exist on the property he paid for. To prove that success did not erase suspicion. To prove that being a black man, even this black man, wasn't a crime. The officer's fingers hovered on the taser's trigger. He stepped closer, eyes hard. This your place. Prove it, he repeated. And Brandon, jaw tight, whispered, I already did. Brandon stood still, the kind of stillness that comes not from fear, but from calculation. One false move. And this didn't end with questions. It ended with headlines. The officer with the taser slowly lowered it. But his eyes stayed sharp. Suspicion didn't ease. It just shifted. The younger one, maybe early 30s with a buzz cut and reflective aviators, stepped forward again. I'm Officer Lindstrom. You say this is your property? Yes, Brandon replied. I've lived here since February. My name is Brandon Keys. You can Google me. I'm the CEO of Nextdyne Technologies. The older officer, McAdams, gave a short exhale that resembled a scoff. That doesn't answer the question. Do you have ID? I'm wearing swim trunks. No ID, huh? I can get it from inside, but I'd prefer if one of you didn't follow me into my home with a hand on your weapon. That line, calm, dignified, but edged with rightful defiance, hung in the air like a moral grenade. Officer McAdams shifted his weight. Lindstrom blinked slowly, uncertain how to respond. I also have proof of ownership on my phone. Let me grab it from the table. Slowly, McAdams warned. Brandon reached for the phone beside his green juice. The same phone that just last week had been used to field a call with the mayor's tech committee. The irony was grotesque. As he unlocked it, his pulse thumped loud in his ears. I have the digital deed from the closing. Here. He tapped into a folder in his email. Pulled up a PDF titled Keys Closing Docs Final. The officers stared down but said nothing. They didn't move. They didn't lean in. Their silence felt heavier than accusation. Brandon turned the phone around. This is my name. This is the address. A pause. Then McAdams muttered. Anyone could Photoshop that. Brandon felt it. That tightening in his chest. That old unwelcome pressure. The one he thought he'd escaped after becoming a millionaire. The one that reminded him. They don't see your resume. They see your skin first. I have mail in the box. Registration in my glove compartment. I'll give you access to my home security system if needed. You're offering it now. Doesn't mean you're not squatting, Lindstrom replied, his tone icy. Brandon almost laughed. Not out of humor but disbelief. A hollow kind of laughter. The one people used to keep from screaming. He had funded this precinct's tech upgrade last fiscal year. When the mayor's office needed help modernizing the APD's data systems, it was Brandon's donation that paid for new body cams and precinct routers. And yet here he stood, explaining why he existed. He glanced toward his home. Ari was still watching, her small hands pressed against the window pane, her eyes glassy, confused, frightened. May I go retrieve my ID? Brandon asked, voice lowered now. Only if one of us escorts you. Brandon gave a sharp nod. Then let's go. Officer McAdams followed behind him, hand still on his belt as though walking a suspect through a crime scene. Inside, Brandon moved slowly, deliberately, narrating each motion, the same way he'd practiced in his head since his 20s, opening drawer, reaching for wallet, pulling out license. Outside, neighbors had begun to gather. At least 7 now. Mostly white. Mostly silent. Some held phones in front of them, recording like spectators at a zoo exhibit. None said a word to defend him. He caught the eye of one man, a hedge fund analyst named Dave, whose dog Brandon once helped rescue from traffic. Dave looked away. Karen Delaney now stood at the gate, arms crossed, lips twitching with self-satisfaction. "I've never seen him before," she declared loudly. "Maybe he broke in." Brandon returned with his ID and walked it over. The officers inspected it. Then came the barrage. "Do you have mail with your name on it?" "Yes." "Car registration?" "In the glove compartment." "Access to home security?" "Yes." "You want the app?" More time passed. They requested he show the security footage of him entering his own home that day. He did. Still, no apology. Just nods, murmurs between officers, and more of that thick silence. Then came the question that cut deeper than any of them had intended to say out loud. "How'd you afford all this?" It wasn't curiosity. It was confrontation disguised as confusion. Brandon stared at them. No response. His mind rewound. To the tech conference in San Francisco where security had asked him if he was with catering. To the VC meeting in Palo Alto where the receptionist had said parking for delivery is around back. To the Harvard Business School gala, where a donor asked who he was shadowing. Every room, every title, every dollar, still not enough. "Is there anything else I can do?" Brandon asked, his voice controlled. "No," McAdams replied. "But next time, sir, please be cooperative from the start." It was said like an afterthought, like a lesson given to a child who failed to respect authority. The knife of hypocrisy turned again. Brandon didn't reply. He couldn't. Not with Ari still watching from the window. Not with the crowd still there feeding on the spectacle of his humiliation. Karen stepped forward again, smug. "Well, if you're the owner, I suppose it's just a misunderstanding," she said, her tone thinly veiled. "But people like us, we look out for each other. You understand, right? People like us." Brandon felt the sentence burn itself into his bones. "I moved in months ago," he said. "I introduced myself at the spring mixer. You shook my hand." Karen blinked, unbothered. "Doesn't ring a bell." The officers exchanged glances. They were no longer the enforcers, just spectators now, watching the social poison work itself through the air. Brandon stood there, barefoot, shirtless, but somehow still carrying more dignity than everyone around him. He looked up at the camera on his porch, red light blinking. It had seen everything. It had witnessed the lesson that no black child should have to learn firsthand. No matter how high you climb, someone will always believe you don't belong. And just as he turned to go inside, thinking, perhaps, it was over, Officer Lindstrom cleared his throat. "One last thing, sir. We're going to have to issue a citation." Brandon froze. "For what?" "Trespassing. Just procedure," Lindstrom said. Brandon stared at the paper. His name, his address, and a box checked trespassing, private property. His hands curled at his sides. "On my own land," he said, voice barely above a whisper. "Standard procedure," McAdams repeated. Behind him, Ari had opened the front door now. Her tiny voice broke the air like a song in a funeral. "Daddy?" Brandon didn't answer her. He couldn't. The officer handed him the citation, and beneath it, scribbled in pen, was the name Karen Delaney, listed as the complainant. Brandon didn't sleep the night after the citation. He stayed seated on the edge of his bed, the paper still clutched in his hands, creased at the center where he had folded it over and over again. Outside, the sprinklers came on just after midnight, mechanical and steady, as if nothing in the world had gone wrong. Inside, Ari had finally cried herself to sleep, but only after asking, "Why did the police think you didn't live here, Daddy?" That question lingered like smoke. The next morning, Brandon put on his sharpest charcoal gray suit and walked with deliberate resolve toward the Willow Bend Estates Community Center. The monthly HOA meeting was scheduled at 10 a.m., and this time, he wouldn't sit quietly in the back. He planned to look Karen Delaney directly in the eye and demand the kind of truth that had no place to hide. The clubhouse was just as manicured and pristine as the rest of the neighborhood. Pale oak walls, brushed nickel fixtures, and a faint smell of citrus cleaner. Around a long mahogany table sat 12 board members, sipping flavored water, and pretending like the world hadn't just seen one of their own racially profiled in real time. Karen sat at the head of the table, wearing a sea blue blouse, her silver blonde bob, freshly ironed. She smiled when Brandon entered, but it was the kind of smile that didn't touch the eyes. A porcelain facade. "Well," she said, folding her hands with exaggerated politeness. "Mr. Keyes, how nice of you to join us. We weren't sure you'd be attending." Brandon didn't respond with a smile. "I wouldn't miss it." Karen motioned to the seat across from her. "We're just getting started. Let's begin with community safety. As you know, there was an incident last week involving a suspicious trespassing report." Brandon's eyes narrowed. "You mean the incident where I was profiled, harassed, and given a citation for standing in my own backyard?" The room shifted. Some cleared their throats. Others pretended to read from their agenda packets. Karen responded with that same tight, polished tone. "I understand there were complications. But as I'm sure you can appreciate, in these times, we must err on the side of caution. We have rules here. Procedures." Brandon leaned forward. "And those procedures include assuming a black man by his own pool is a criminal?" "Mr. Keyes, I live here. I've paid every HOA fee on time. I volunteered for neighborhood tech upgrades. I've introduced myself at 3 community events." Karen blinked, expression unchanged. "I'm sorry, I just don't recall meeting you." Another lie, and Brandon saw it for exactly what it was. "I spoke with you personally at the spring mixer. You told me your son worked in biotech, and that he'd love what my company was doing. Or was that another black man you assumed was the help?" A few board members looked down, suddenly very interested in their notes. Karen paused, then offered a composed shrug. "Perhaps there was a misunderstanding, but let's not derail today's agenda. We've had reports from residents about a growing concern with the unauthorized usage of the community pool areas." Brandon arched an eyebrow. "Unauthorized usage?" "Yes," she said crisply. "That brings us to a proposed rule update. All residents will now be required to wear visible photo ID badges while using the pool and clubhouse areas. It's a simple measure to ensure security and identification." Brandon's voice cut the room in half. "So now I need permission to relax in my own backyard?" "It's about clarity, Mr. Keyes." "No, it's about control," he replied. "Let's not dress this up with neutral language. You're institutionalizing suspicion. You didn't suggest this rule when the Donovans threw a birthday party here with 30 guests who weren't from the community. You didn't suggest it when 3 teenagers scaled the fence last summer. You suggest it now, after my incident." Karen's smile faltered for the first time. Board member Alan West, a lanky man with horn-rimmed glasses, finally spoke, barely a whisper. "It's just a policy suggestion, nothing personal." "It's deeply personal," Brandon snapped. "You are making it clear that people like me don't fit your image of who belongs here. You're not protecting anyone. You're preserving something." No one responded. Some nodded, subtly. Others stared at the table. The air was thick with the unspoken. Brandon scanned the room. These were his neighbors. The same people who waved when he jogged past in the mornings, who nodded at Ari in the carpool lane, who smiled through their teeth at block parties. Smiles. With knives behind their backs. He felt it in his bones now. This place wasn't built for people like him. It tolerated him. Until it didn't. The vote was taken quietly. The new rule passed 7. Brandon rose from his seat. "You know what scares me?" he said, eyes slowly panning the room. "Not the cops. Not the Karen next door. It's the people who sit quietly and pretend they're neutral. The ones who think silence is harmless." He didn't wait for a reply. He left, heels clicking against the floor like a final verdict. The next morning, Brandon opened his garage to take Ari to school. The sky was still soft pink, birds rustling awake, and that's when he saw it. His black Tesla, parked just outside the garage, had deep jagged lines carved across the side panels, like claw marks. Someone had keyed the paint in brutal, unforgiving strokes. The windshield bore a single word, scrawled in red spray paint: "Get out." He stared for several long seconds, not in disbelief. He was well past disbelief now, but in recognition. He had seen this message before, even if the font changed. He'd seen it in rejection emails, in whispered comments, in narrowed eyes at boardrooms. Ari stepped out of the front door and gasped. Her hand flew to her mouth. She started crying again. Brandon didn't move. He just stood there, hand tightening around his keys, watching the word drip down the glass. And then tucked under his windshield wiper, he noticed something new. A folded envelope. Inside, a handwritten note. "This isn't your neighborhood, Brandon. And it never will be." Brandon Keyes walked through the glass doors of Nextine Technologies, with the same stride he'd mastered over a decade. Tall, confident, deliberate. But today, his steps felt heavier, his jaw tighter. He passed the familiar glow of the vertical LED logo near the reception desk, where two interns barely looked up. That was new. They usually greeted him with excited nods, sometimes stammered hello. He didn't take it personally. Not right away. He entered the elevator, alone, and pressed the button for the top floor. His floor. The elevator music felt oddly invasive today. A breezy jazz cover of Ain't No Mountain High Enough that suddenly rang hollow. Brandon stared at his own reflection in the brushed steel navy suit. Clean fade, skin smooth from a fresh shave. The image of a CEO, but the look in his eyes betrayed something else. A man still replaying every second of last weekend's ambush. The door opened to his private floor. His assistant Melanie glanced up from her screen with an awkward smile. "Morning, Mr. Keyes." He nodded, briskly. "Any fires?" She hesitated. "Just the usual." That pause was telling. As he entered his office, a sprawling corner space of glass, walnut and minimalist elegance, Brandon immediately noticed his desk monitor lit up with dozens of emails marked urgent. He sat, unlocked the screen, and scanned the headlines. CEO Brandon Keyes accused of trespassing in own neighborhood. Was he targeted or was he aggressive? Viral footage divides internet. Black tech mogul versus HOA, the race debate behind the pool incident. His breath caught when he opened the clip. Someone, probably Karen or one of the nosy neighbors, had filmed part of the police encounter. In it, Brandon appeared shirtless and agitated, hands raised, the officers flanking him with suspicion. There was no context, no footage of the 911 call, no mention of the years of microaggressions, just 22 seconds that now defined him in the eyes of millions. The comments beneath it were brutal. "Looks shady AF. Why didn't he just show ID? Looks like he's hiding something. Bet he pulled the race card when things didn't go his way." And the worst, not surprised, just another thug with a tech front. Brandon closed the tab. He stared out over downtown Atlanta, the skyline etched in morning haze. Everything he had built, brick by metaphorical brick, now swayed on the edge of public opinion, all because one woman decided he didn't look like he belonged. By noon, things had worsened. He walked into the weekly investor strategy session, usually held in the sleek executive boardroom, with its unobstructed view of the city. Today, 2 seats were conspicuously empty. VC partners who had once begged to be in Brandon's orbit were now postponing meetings. His CTO, Jonah Simmons, gave him a sympathetic nod as the door closed. But even Jonah's body language had shifted, guarded, like someone tiptoeing around a fragile object. We might want to reframe our marketing language around security and facial AI," Jonah began, sliding a document across the table. "There's buzz." Brandon didn't flinch. "Buzz?" Jonah swallowed. "Some people think it's ironic. Our flagship algorithm promotes neighborhood safety, and now you're in the middle of this. This racist fiasco." Brandon finished for him, calm but icy. Silence. Then someone else chimed in, Derek, one of the newer board members. "Look, Brandon, this isn't about your leadership. We just think, until this dies down, it might be smart to step back from public appearances. Let Melanie do press. Recenter the brand." Brandon's stare turned steel. "You want me to disappear from the company I built because I was racially profiled by cops on my own lawn?" Derek's eyes darted. "No, not disappear. Just recalibrate the optics." That word. Optics. It stabbed deeper than they knew. Brandon rose from his seat. "Let me be clear. This company exists because I didn't hide. I showed up, every time, in rooms where no one looked like me. If you think I'm going to sit this out because it makes you uncomfortable, you've got the wrong CEO." He left the room without waiting for permission. Back in his office, the glass felt colder. The skyline no longer inspired. He stared at the CNBC interview, looping silently on the office television. It was him, just months ago, talking about AI equity and urban tech. Now, the volume was off. He could see his own mouth moving, his hands gesturing, but no sound emerged. Muted. Like they wanted him to be now. The knock on the door came gently. Melanie stepped in, holding a yellow envelope. This came, no return address, just your name. Brandon took it. She hesitated again, then added, "People are watching everything. Just be careful, okay?" He nodded. When she left, he opened the envelope. Inside was a single printed sheet. "They're planning to expel you from the HOA. You didn't hear it from me." Brandon stared. There was no signature, just that typed sentence. The paper trembled slightly in his fingers. He couldn't tell if it was the air conditioning or his pulse. Expel him? From his own neighborhood? Legally, HOA boards could initiate a forced sale under certain bylaws. Claims of community endangerment, repeated violations, property devaluation. He thought back to the new ID rule. The citation, the whispering boardroom. They were laying the groundwork. He stood slowly, crossed the room, and looked out the window again. This time not at Atlanta, but at his own reflection. They didn't just want to erase his public image. They wanted to erase him from everything he had earned. Just then his phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. They've started surveilling your house. Cameras. Microphones. Trust no one. Brandon sat alone in his home office, surrounded by legal pads, printouts, and 2 monitors filled with spreadsheets and PDFs. The soft hum of the security system echoed in the background. His once comforting luxury, now a reminder that he couldn't let his guard down, not even here, especially not here. The anonymous text about surveillance had sent his mind spinning. For a man who built tech that protected others, the violation cut deep. He began checking every vent, every shrub, every possible blind spot around the house. He even ran an electromagnetic scan of his home network, and to his horror found a ghost device piggybacking on his Wi-Fi signal. Somebody had planted it. Someone inside the gates. But Brandon wasn't about to play defense forever. He dug into the HOA bylaws first. Every clause, every fine print detail tucked into 128 pages of bureaucratic language. What he found chilled him. The board had broad authority to issue fines, implement new regulations, and in sustained breach cases, recommend forced sale of a property. But the vagueness of what constituted a sustained breach left too much to interpretation. Brandon looked deeper. He filed a formal request under the HOA's transparency policy for violation records over the past 2 years. After multiple emails and subtle stonewalling, the documents finally arrived. What they revealed wasn't just suspicious, it was deliberate. Of the last 42 written violations, 36 were issued to Black or Latino homeowners, and only 2 white residents had ever received more than a verbal warning. The nature of the infractions ranged from garage door left open after 10 p.m. to unapproved lawn decoration. Brandon's own citation for unauthorized presence at pool area was nestled between one for improper mailbox design and another for excessive patio furniture. The pattern was grotesquely clear. Non-white residents were being targeted through paper, policy, and protocol. He called the only person he trusted to see it as clearly as he did. Tasha Freeman, his old college friend, and a civil rights attorney with a spine of steel and a memory like a filing cabinet. As she scanned the records over a video call, her expression darkened. "This isn't about rules," she said. "It's about removal. They're using the HOA as a scalpel, a paper noose." Brandon nodded grimly. "I can fight it, right?" Tasha leaned in. "Yes, but it'll be brutal and expensive. They're betting you'll fold to save face." He looked past the screen to the wall behind it, where Ari's drawings hung in frames. He had once told her they'd never leave this house unless it was by choice, on their own terms. But the walls were closing in. At school, things had already shifted. Ari came home one afternoon, unusually quiet. Her backpack was still zipped, untouched. When Brandon asked her about her day, she shrugged. He let it go. But that night, as he passed her room, he overheard muffled sobs. She was on FaceTime with her cousin Mila, whispering. "They laughed at me," she said. "They said Daddy got arrested because he snuck into the pool." Brandon froze in the hallway. The pain was instant, raw, choking. His daughter was paying the price for a system she was too young to understand. He wanted to shield her, build walls of protection. But even in the best house money could buy, there were cracks he couldn't patch. Later that evening, over dinner, Ari asked softly, "Why do they hate us here?" He didn't know how to answer. Not fully. But he did know one thing. He couldn't run. Not again. Not this time. "If I leave," he whispered to Tasha during their next call, "they win. They rewrite the narrative. They make this look like it was about me being difficult instead of them being deliberate." Tasha agreed. "Then you document everything. Build your own case." So he did. Every neighbor's passive-aggressive remark, every misdirected HOA letter, every complaint that seemed just a bit too convenient. He cataloged them all, created a timeline, built a spreadsheet. Then came the real twist. a younger tech analyst at his company, who lived 2 blocks away and had once worked a temp job for the HOA's data migration, pinged him discreetly. "Mr. Keys, I think you should see this." It was a screenshot of a private WhatsApp group, WBE Watchdog Coalition, a digital backchannel where certain HOA members, including Karen Delaney, discussed preserving the character of the neighborhood. Brandon scrolled through the messages, jaw tightening. One read, "Anyone know who the black guy at the clubhouse is? He's there a lot lately." Another, "He's flashy, draws attention, not good for home values." And then, the dagger. "Karen Delaney. He doesn't belong here. Let's make him want to leave." Brandon felt a coldness crawl through his veins. This wasn't paranoia. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was premeditated, coordinated. The mask had slipped, and behind it the face of racism was smirking, casual, confident. He copied every message, timestamp and user profile. Backed it up to 3 drives. This wasn't just HOA pettiness. This was targeted exclusion. Perhaps even grounds for a civil suit. But before he could fully plan his next move, something unexpected happened. That same night, while sitting in the living room, reviewing messages, his phone buzzed again. Another unknown number. Just one sentence. "There's a deeper chat. They don't know we found it yet." The message included a screenshot, a separate group titled WBE Exec Only, with a blurred preview of a conversation. The visible line from Karen read, "We've handled bigger threats before. Brandon won't last the summer." Brandon stared at the dim glow of his screen as the clock rolled past midnight. The screenshot from the WBE Exec Only group chat glared back at him, that one sentence ringing louder than the silence in his home. Brandon won't last the summer. It was no longer about property violations or poolside accusations. This was a campaign, organized, targeted, and cloaked in HOA bureaucracy. He leaned back in his chair, took a long breath, and made a decision that broke every bone in his professional instinct for privacy. He copied the entire folder of messages, both from the general HOA chat and the secret executive group, into a secure cloud drive. Then, under a pseudonym, Justice in the Bend, he sent the files to 3 Atlanta-based journalists known for covering civil rights cases. No fanfare, no signature. Just a clean subject line: "How white suburbia silently excludes its black neighbors. Digital proof inside." Within 48 hours, the internet exploded. Local news was the first to bite. A widely read independent outlet, the Atlanta Signal, published a scathing exposé titled "The Gated Truth: How an Atlanta HOA Waged Digital War on a Black CEO." It included redacted screenshots from the WhatsApp chat, with Karen Delaney's name unmistakably featured beside her now infamous message. Then came the dominoes. Twitter caught fire. Pool. While black surged to the #1 trending spot for 3 days straight. Influencers, journalists, and public figures reposted the thread with outrage and disbelief. TikTok videos began popping up with dramatic readings of the leaked texts, side by side with aerial shots of Brandon's house and the community gates that had now become a symbol of exclusion. It didn't take long for celebrities to chime in. A-list actor Isaiah Reddick tweeted, "You can own the land, the house, and the deed. But in America, blackness is still on lease." Political activist and lawyer Reina Torres posted, "This isn't just an HOA scandal. It's a modern blueprint for institutional racism. And we've got the receipts." Brandon watched it all unfold. Like an out-of-body experience. He had never asked for fame. He had avoided the spotlight when his company went public. But this moment wasn't about ego. It was about truth. Karen, meanwhile, panicked. In a local TV interview, she insisted she had been taken out of context, claiming that the messages were meant to be private expressions of concern, not racism. But as more screenshots leaked, including one where she wrote, "He acts like he bought the whole neighborhood. We need to show him how things work here," her story collapsed. Digital forensics experts confirmed the authenticity of the chat archives. Her denial became a meme. One tweet read, "Karen Delaney, victim of context. Also victim of her own damn texts." But the fallout wasn't just digital. Brandon, emboldened now, stepped into the public sphere not as a victim, but as a witness. As someone forced to carry the weight of proof, yet willing to share it. He appeared on the Morning Atlanta show, calmly unpacking what had happened. "I didn't move into Willow Bend to start a fight. I moved there for peace. But when peace is denied to you because of the color of your skin, silence becomes complicity. I'm not angry at rules. I'm angry at how they're applied. He was invited to podcasts, Code Switch, The Race Rundown, Breaking Barriers, where his voice offered clarity not just on his own case, but on the broader mechanics of racial gatekeeping in affluent spaces. A week later, he got an email from a grassroots organization called New Equity Neighbors, a coalition fighting for housing justice across America. They asked him to serve as a national spokesperson for HOA reform. Brandon hesitated. He had a company to protect, a daughter to shield. But he couldn't ignore the impact. He said yes. In the weeks that followed, Brandon's voice echoed across virtual town halls, school boards, and real estate forums. He talked about paper chains, how HOAs could use fines and vague rules to harass families of color into leaving, and how most people didn't even realize it was happening. Under pressure from media and residents alike, the Willow Bend HOA board had no choice but to act. An emergency session was called to address Karen's misconduct. The meeting was set for a Tuesday evening. Residents were notified. Board members would vote on whether to formally remove Karen Delaney as president and strip her of any future leadership eligibility. Karen, defiant to the end, posted a message to the neighborhood Facebook group. "I will not be bullied out of my role. I acted in the best interest of our community, not to please woke mobs." Brandon didn't reply. He didn't have to. The neighborhood itself had shifted. A petition to remove Karen had garnered over 1,200 signatures, many from residents who had once stayed silent. A few came forward to confess regret. "I never spoke up," one neighbor wrote in the petition's comments. "I saw what they were doing to Brandon and convinced myself it wasn't my problem. I was wrong." On the night of the vote, Brandon arrived at the clubhouse wearing a gray blazer and dark jeans, clean, calm, unmoved by the stairs. He was seated in the front row, directly facing the board members behind the long, polished table. Karen was there too, in a pale yellow blouse and gold pin, her eyes darting like a trapped animal. Her usual composure had cracked. The vote began. One by one, the board members cast their choice: remove or retain. Brandon counted silently. 3 for removal. 2 against. 4 more votes to go. Another remove. Then another retain. 5-3. Then a pause. Board member Alan West, the man who once mumbled passive defenses in earlier meetings, hesitated. He looked down, then said retain. Brandon blinked. That made it 5-4. 2 votes remained. The next board member voted. Remove. 5-5. All eyes turned to the final voter, Board Secretary Lillian Moore, a retired librarian known for rarely speaking at meetings. She adjusted her glasses, cleared her throat. Her hands trembled slightly. I think both sides have made mistakes," she said, "but we're a community, and our leadership should reflect our values." She dropped her vote into the box. The room was silent as the chair counted the final tally. Then he announced it, voice flat. Final vote 6-6. The motion does not pass. A sharp gasp cut through the room. Someone whispered, "You're kidding." Brandon didn't move. He sat still, back straight, face unreadable. Inside, he felt the heat of betrayal, not because Karen had clung to her seat, but because even now, after everything, half the board had still protected her. As Brandon rose to leave, a man he'd never seen before brushed past him discreetly and whispered, "The tie wasn't real. One of the votes was switched before counting. They're rigging it." Brandon didn't flinch when the stranger whispered the truth. The weight of it hit like a second wind, not paralyzing, but electrifying. As he walked out of the clubhouse, the night air felt sharper, heavier, like it knew it carried more than disappointment. It carried betrayal. Inside his car, he replayed the vote in his head, one detail gnawing at him: the proxy ballot Lillian Moore had submitted on behalf of an absent board member, a name Brandon had never heard at any previous meeting. Martin Ashcombe, a supposed investor who, according to Karen, preferred privacy. Something was off. Brandon returned home and dove into research. Within 20 minutes, he confirmed what his gut already suspected. Martin Ashcombe had moved out of the neighborhood 10 months ago. His house had been sold and converted into a short-term rental. He had no legal standing to vote. Yet somehow his proxy ballot had not only been accepted, but had tipped the balance to save Karen's seat. It was fraud. Quiet, subtle, bureaucratic, but fraud all the same. The next morning, Brandon posted the evidence anonymously through the Justice in the Bend account. Property sale records, HOA bylaws, and a time-stamped image of the vote ledger, with Martin's forged signature. The internet lit up again.
This time, even the Atlanta Journal-Constitution picked up the story.
Fraud in the suburbs. HOA scandal deepens in Willow Bend. Karen tried to deny the forgery, claiming clerical miscommunication. But under mounting pressure and threat of legal exposure, the board agreed to a second vote, this time supervised by an independent neighborhood mediator. The announcement sent shockwaves through the community. Lawn signs popped up overnight. One read, "Protect our values, keep Karen." Another, "Integrity over legacy, vote her out." Neighborhood group chats turned venomous. Old friendships strained under sudden political lines. Some white neighbors who had once kept silent now apologized openly, while others doubled down, calling Brandon a troublemaker, accusing him of turning the neighborhood into a battleground. Brandon didn't respond to the noise. He focused on what mattered, protecting his family. The morning after the announcement, Uri came home from school, unusually quiet. She didn't even take off her backpack before sitting on the stairs. Brandon crouched down, concerned. "You okay, baby?" She nodded, but her eyes filled instantly. She reached into her bag and pulled out a crumpled note. A torn piece of lined paper, written in thick marker. "Go back to the ghetto. You don't belong here." Brandon's vision went hot. His daughter had been dragged into a war she never asked for, and now, like the shadow of his own childhood, the words that once haunted him were being weaponized against his child. That night, Brandon didn't sleep. He walked the perimeter of his property, noting every blind spot. He upgraded his camera system, installed motion-triggered floodlights, and added license plate readers to the driveway. But he wasn't just protecting his house. He was preparing for a different kind of defense. One rooted in data. He spent the next 2 weeks coding a new mobile app. Simple interface. Anonymous reporting. Secure back-end encryption. He called it Bias Beacon, a tool designed to empower residents to document racial harassment, microaggressions, or discriminatory HOA actions, without fear of retaliation. The app launched quietly, but spread fast. Within 3 days, over 300 local residents, and even a few from neighboring communities, downloaded it. Reports began to flow in. One Latina couple had been fined for garden clutter while their white neighbor's lawn gnomes went unnoticed. A black teen had been questioned by security for jogging too close to the clubhouse. Brandon anonymized and compiled the data into a public dashboard. The patterns were undeniable, and now they were undeniably visible. At the second HOA vote, held in the same clubhouse, the energy had shifted. Even Karen's allies looked uneasy. This time, no proxy votes were allowed. This time, Brandon brought a printed stack of Bias Beacon reports. One by one, residents walked in, cast their ballots, and left. Eyes lowered, shoulders tight. When the final tally was read, it echoed like thunder. Karen Delaney, removed from office. Brandon didn't smile. He didn't celebrate. He simply stood, nodded once, and walked out. Justice had come, but the damage lingered. And then came the twist that would expose just how far Karen had gone. That evening, a video appeared online. A former HOA intern, a young man named Darius, who had helped with data entry during the summer, uploaded a screen recording of a Zoom call. It was Karen, clear as day, no distortion, no ambiguity. She was speaking to another board member, voice cold and clipped. "Install it behind the garage. I want all motion data streamed. If he's hosting meetings, I want to know when. If he's planning legal action, I want the first whisper." Darius explained in a caption that Karen had ordered hidden surveillance cameras placed on HOA-owned trees, bordering Brandon's property, an invasion of privacy justified as community safety. The video went viral within hours. National networks picked it up. Legal analysts weighed in. Brandon watched it unfold from his office, the screen glowing in the dark like a confession. He wasn't shocked anymore, just resolute, because now the world didn't just believe him. Now they had proof. That night, a knock sounded at his door. Brandon opened it to find a courier holding an unmarked envelope. Inside, a subpoena. Karen was suing him for defamation. The envelope in Brandon's hand felt heavier than paper should. Karen's lawsuit, a desperate last-ditch swipe cloaked in legal jargon, was her way of rewriting the story as hers again. He read through the complaint with calculated patience. Defamation, character assassination, damage to social reputation, loss of professional affiliations. She accused him of waging a digital smear campaign that had ruined her life. He almost laughed. She'd surveilled his home, orchestrated a neighborhood campaign of exclusion, and manipulated HOA votes, but now claimed she was the victim. It was textbook. The next morning, Karen's removal became official. A brief statement from the HOA announced her departure, in accordance with member vote and legal consultation. No apology, no acknowledgement of wrongdoing. Just sanitized silence. Brandon expected no fanfare. He didn't want it. But what came next surprised him. 2 days later, an email landed in his inbox from the interim HOA chair, Judith Roper, an older black woman who'd moved in only a year before and had mostly kept to herself during the chaos. She wrote, "Mr. Keyes, I'm deeply sorry for what you've endured. If you're willing, we'd like to invite you to join the board. Your voice deserves to be in the room where the damage was done." Brandon stared at the screen, unsure at first. The HOA had been a cage. Could he turn it into a tool? He replied with only one sentence. "I'll join, but only under one condition. Full transparency." Judith replied within the hour. "Done." At the next board meeting, smaller now, tense but quiet, Brandon took his seat. He didn't bring rage. He brought receipts. His first motion, a new community equity policy. Mandatory anti-bias training for board members. Public audits of all HOA fines and enforcement records. Community review panels for future rule proposals. Anonymous complaint reporting tied to his bias beacon app. The room stiffened. Some board members nodded cautiously. Others leaned back, arms folded. "It's too much," Alan West muttered. "You turning a homeowners association into a social justice laboratory." Brandon didn't flinch. "I'm turning it into a community. That's what it's supposed to be." Debate flared. But when Judith called the vote, it passed. The policy would take effect within 60 days. News traveled fast. The story made it to a national evening broadcast, with Brandon framed against the suburban backdrop that had once tried to erase him. A segment on CBS Reports titled "Black and Barred, Owning While Black" aired across the country. It showed Ari drawing on the porch, Brandon checking his security cameras, and snippets from the clubhouse vote. He spoke with the weight of someone who never wanted to be a symbol, but had no other choice. "Power doesn't always look like a badge or a gun," he told the reporter. "Sometimes it's a clipboard, and a neighbor who decides who belongs." The episode sparked outrage and reflection. Letters poured in. Some thanked him, others cursed him, but more than anything, people began to see. Then came the real move. Brandon filed a civil rights lawsuit. 2 actually, one against the Willow Bend HOA for racial discrimination and housing violations. The other against the Atlanta Police Department for wrongful detainment, negligence, and enabling racial profiling. The ACLU picked up the case within days. It was unprecedented. A dual suit that could expose how systemic racism operated in the invisible architecture of American suburbs. His lawyers held a press conference. Brandon stood behind them, silent but centered. "This case isn't about one man," the lead attorney said. "It's about the weaponization of policy, about how racism wears khakis and calls itself procedural. We are challenging the illusion of equity." The neighborhood roiled. Some residents held quiet gatherings to show support. Others sent threatening letters. One day, Brandon found a box of rotten fruit on his doorstep with a note, "You've poisoned this place." Still, he didn't stop. He kept coding updates to Bias Beacon. He met with black realtors about the patterns they'd seen. He spoke at a law school symposium on digital justice and neighborhood bias. Ari watched it all, quiet but proud. Then came the twist. During court-mandated discovery, one of Brandon's attorneys uncovered an internal police memo filed shortly after the initial pool incident. It was part of the 911 dispatch follow-up, listing the anonymous tip that initiated the response. The language was familiar, too familiar. The caller used phrases like "looks out of place," "prowling," and "not who usually lives there." The speech pattern matched someone they'd heard before. Brandon's team subpoenaed additional dispatch records and compared them to the WhatsApp chat transcripts. The match was chilling. The anonymous tip had come from a still-seated HOA board member. The same board member who had voted retain in the first HOA vote. The same one who had kept mostly quiet since Karen's removal. When confronted with the evidence, the board member, Thomas Hensley, initially denied everything. But the call logs didn't lie. He had used a burner phone. The lawsuit now had a smoking gun. A clear link between the HOA board and the unlawful police response. The judge ordered a review of all HOA communications from the previous year. The HOA's legal team, scrambling, requested mediation. Brandon's team refused. Let the truth come out, he said. All of it. 1 week later, Brandon's lawyers received an encrypted USB drive anonymously in the mail, labeled simply, "You missed something." When they opened it, what they saw wasn't just HOA emails. It was a video feed from Brandon's own backyard, dated months before the pool incident. The USB drive sat in the center of the conference table, humming in the silence like a ticking bomb. Brandon, his attorneys, and 2 data forensic analysts leaned in as the video loaded. What appeared on screen chilled the room. It wasn't grainy. It wasn't distant. It was a high-resolution, motion-activated surveillance feed. Brandon's backyard, his patio, his pool, his daughter. The first clip dated back 5 months prior to the day of the incident, well before the police confrontation. In the video, Brandon could be seen helping Ari build a cardboard rocket for a school project. He held duct tape in one hand, a juice pouch in the other. Harmless, beautiful, private. But what disturbed him wasn't just the footage itself, it was the angle. It had clearly been recorded from a height and position only accessible from the HOA-owned land behind his back fence. This wasn't a Ring camera hack. Someone had installed unauthorized surveillance equipment months before anyone had called 911. The second clip showed Brandon reading by the pool. The third, Ari dancing barefoot on the patio. It was a violation deeper than he'd known possible. An intimacy stolen without consent. Brandon closed his eyes and sat back in the chair. He didn't speak for several seconds. "This changes everything," his lead attorney Melissa Grant said quietly. "It shows premeditation, pattern surveillance, targeting. This is bigger than a wrongful arrest. It's civil conspiracy." They agreed to have the footage authenticated by a third-party forensic firm before presenting it in court. Meanwhile, Brandon's team prepared the next legal salvo. A full subpoena of all HOA communications for the past 18 months, text messages, emails, Slack threads, private cloud folders. Every file, every memo, every piece of HOA correspondence. It didn't take long for the cracks to deepen. Behind the scenes, the HOA board was fracturing. Rumors leaked that at least 2 board members were considering resigning. One of them, a middle-aged divorcee named Rachel Barris, reached out to Brandon's team through her lawyer. She wanted immunity in exchange for testimony. Rachel had copies of email threads between Karen and several members coordinating citations against minority homeowners. She had screenshots of Slack messages that joked about Brandon's outburst and plotted ways to trigger more HOA violations legally. Her voice, once silent, was now pivotal. But the police union was mounting its own defense. In a carefully worded press release, they stated that the officers' actions on the day of the pool incident were in accordance with departmental protocol, driven by a call from a concerned resident, not racial bias. They referenced officer safety, procedure, and community protection. But public sentiment wasn't on their side. Following the viral video, media coverage, and Brandon's rising platform, social pressure mounted. Advocacy groups launched petitions. Civil rights attorneys flooded social media with commentary. One clip from Brandon's TV interview, "They didn't question if I had a home. They questioned if I deserved one," had been viewed 8.7 million times on TikTok alone. Under this pressure, the city of Atlanta launched a formal misconduct inquiry into the police department's handling of the case. The mayor's office released a statement. "No city is above the truth. When our systems harm the very citizens they're meant to protect, we must ask why." In the middle of all this, Brandon tried to hold together what mattered most: his daughter. He found Ari in her room one night, curled into the side of her bed, tracing the lines of a drawing she'd made. 2 stick figures holding hands. One tall, one small. The caption read, "Me pole daddy, always safe." But even she didn't feel safe anymore. That night, Brandon sat beside her, heart heavier than any deposition he'd faced. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "For all of it. I thought I was shielding you, but I brought you into the fight." Ari didn't speak. She just reached for his hand and held it tightly. The next morning, Brandon called a child therapist recommended by one of the attorneys. Ari began weekly sessions. Slowly, her smile returned, cautious, but real. One afternoon, after dropping her off at school, Brandon drove through downtown. That's when he saw it. Across a red-bricked wall not far from City Hall, a new mural had been painted. It was him and Ari, her hand in his, walking forward. Behind them, faded shadows of police lights and clipped HOA letters. Above them, painted in bold, defiant strokes. The word, "Still we rise." Brandon parked and stood before it for a long time, silent. It didn't erase what had happened, but it reminded him. They were seen. Their story mattered. But just when the tide seemed to be turning, when lawsuits were gaining traction and the public was rallying behind him, a new threat emerged. Brandon received a call from his CFO, Lisa. "We need to talk," she said, voice tight. That afternoon they met in his office. She placed a printed email on his desk. It was from a venture capital fund, one of their biggest backers, responsible for nearly $5 million in committed investment to Nextdyne. The message was blunt. "Brandon, while we've admired your vision and leadership, the ongoing legal controversy surrounding your name has become a reputational concern for our board. We strongly recommend discontinuing your involvement in the lawsuit to protect the brand equity of Nextdyne. Failure to do so may result in a withdrawal of funds and termination of our support." Brandon read the message 3 times. It wasn't just blackmail. It was pressure from inside the machine he built. Lisa spoke, careful but clear. "I'm not telling you what to do, but you need to know, if we lose that funding, we'll have to freeze 3 departments. People will lose jobs." Brandon didn't answer right away. He walked to the window. Atlanta looked different now. The same skyline, but shaped by battle. If he stayed the course, he might lose millions, perhaps his company. But if he gave in, if he silenced the truth for money, he'd lose something far greater. That night, Brandon posted a cryptic tweet from his personal account. "What would you sacrifice to make history?" Minutes later, a DM popped up from a burner account. "They're trying to buy you out, but we already leaked something bigger. You have 24 hours before it hits." The office was quiet, too quiet. Brandon stood at the window, arms folded, watching the clouds roll in over Atlanta's skyline like slow-moving smoke. Behind him, the email still blinked on the screen. Its message simple, cold, and strategic. "Withdraw the lawsuits. Make this go away. We'll restore full funding immediately. Otherwise, Nextdyne faces operational reevaluation. Decision needed by Friday." There was no signature, only the sanitized letterhead of Easton Partners Capital, the same firm that had once toasted to his vision, over rooftop cocktails in Midtown, their flutes clinking with promises of a tech future shaped by his innovation. Now, they saw him as a liability. He turned slowly and sat down, his hands threading together beneath his chin. He hadn't told the team yet, not even Lisa. He needed to think, to remember who he was, before the boardrooms and the magazine covers. His fingers brushed the corner of a worn photo frame on his desk. His mother, Teresa Keys, standing in front of her South Memphis apartment, her hand resting on Brandon's shoulder. He was 17 in that photo, all eyes and gray. Her voice came back like a ghost on the wind. "Don't ever sell yourself short, baby. Not for their comfort, not for their approval. Dignity don't come with commas. It comes with choices." It was one of the last things she'd said before cancer took her. He had held her hand in that hospice room, promising he'd make her proud. He hadn't known then how much that promise would cost. He closed his eyes, inhaled deep. The next morning, Brandon called a press conference. He didn't tell his lawyers until after. Didn't run it through PR. It wasn't a calculated move. It was truth. The room was packed. Reporters, cameras, activists, curious strangers. Brandon stood behind the podium, wearing no tie, sleeves rolled up, vulnerable, but unshaken. "I never thought I'd be here," he began, his voice steady but low. "Not as a CEO, not as a homeowner, not as a black man in America. But here I am. Because silence has a cost, and I'm not willing to pay it anymore." He held up a printout of the donor's ultimatum. "This is what systemic pressure looks like. This is how power tries to buy justice away. I was told that if I dropped my lawsuits, if I stepped back, played nice, stayed quiet, I'd be rewarded. My company would be safe. My employees protected." He paused. "But what kind of leader would I be if I taught the people watching, my daughter, my team, my community, that comfort is worth more than courage?" A hush fell across the room. "I choose to fight." By evening, the press conference had gone viral. Clips were everywhere. Headlines blared. "Black CEO calls out corporate coercion in live broadcast." Twitter threads dissected every word. TikTok was flooded with young creators using the soundbite "comfort over courage" over montages of resistance. The donations poured in. Within 72 hours, over 200,000 new users downloaded the Bias Beacon app. Civil rights organizations contributed legal funds. Anonymous tech workers sent in support through Bitcoin wallets and encrypted messages. Even Nextdyne employees rallied behind him. Lisa hosted a company-wide Zoom town hall where staff unanimously voted to accept temporary salary freezes if necessary. "You built this," one engineer wrote in Slack. "We'll help protect it." Ari drew a new picture and taped it to his fridge. A superhero, with Dad on his chest, standing in front of a courthouse. The company didn't collapse. It evolved. New equity-focused investors stepped in. Former partners who had gone silent reached out to re-engage, now seeing Brandon not as a risk but as a movement. A week later, The Atlantic ran a feature titled "The CEO Who Chose Conscience Over Capital," chronicling Brandon's rise, his stand, and the cultural firestorm he helped ignite. And then came the offers. His agent, a calm, Harvard-trained negotiator named Colleen, called with two major updates. "Brandon, you've got a book deal. Big one. Advance is mid-six figures. Memoir style. They want your journey, your voice, your framing." Brandon exhaled. "Okay." And Colleen hesitated. "Also, Netflix." He sat up straighter. "Netflix?"
They want a limited docu-series. 6 episodes. Your story, interviews, Ari, HOA tapes, the app, the court fight, all of it. They see this as the next When They See Us. Huge potential.
His heart beat faster. He hadn't sought fame, but if this could amplify the cause, shine a light on how subtle racism creeps into zip codes and rulebooks, maybe it was worth it. "Any conditions?" he asked. Colleen paused again. "Just one," she said slowly. "They want you to avoid naming certain individuals. Karen, Thomas, a few HOA board members. They're concerned about lawsuits, brand liability, tone." Brandon felt his stomach tighten. "Wait, you mean the people who caused all of this? They're worried naming names makes it feel too specific, too dangerous." He leaned back in his chair. The hum of Atlanta outside his window pulsed like a clock counting down. So here it was again. Another price tag. Another invitation to dilute the truth for comfort's sake. That night, Brandon opened his email and found a new message from an unknown address. Subject line: "If you're going to tell the story, you might as well show this." Attached was a folder labeled HOA Meeting Audio Leaks. Brandon sat in the dark, the only light in his study coming from the screen in front of him. The audio files were organized by date, each file timestamped and labeled by the sender. Anonymous but meticulous. He clicked play on the first. It was unmistakably Karen. "He's too visible now. We should have handled this earlier, before the media got wind of it." Another voice replied. "Thomas."
"He's got money, Karen. He'll drag this out. But if we freeze him out properly, complaint by complaint, we can drain his energy. Trust me, it'll work."
Click. The next file, dated weeks before Brandon's police incident, revealed even more. Karen again chuckling. "He thinks just because he owns a pool, he owns the neighborhood." The malice in her voice was the kind that couldn't be misunderstood. It wasn't frustration. It was control threatened and clawing back. Brandon closed the laptop and stared at the wall. That was all the confirmation he needed. Every name, every word, every tactic. Exposed. Netflix would have to wait. The next morning he called Colleen. "No deal," he said flatly. There was a pause on the line. "Brandon, are you positive? I'm not signing my name to anything that wants to edit the truth. No blurred faces. No bleeped audio. If they want my story, they take all of it. Names included." Colleen was silent for a few moments, then said softly, "Okay, then we do it your way." Brandon felt something settle in his chest. It wasn't peace, but it was clarity. He opened a blank document that night and began typing the first line of his memoir. "On the day they called the cops, I wasn't just swimming. I was existing. That's what made me dangerous." He titled it Poolside Prejudice. The writing poured out of him like water cracking through a dam. He wrote about the smells of his Memphis childhood. Wet concrete, frying catfish, the scent of bleach in his mother's scrubs. He wrote about Harvard investors who patted his back and asked where he played college ball. He wrote about Ari, her silent questions, her lion drawings, her tears, and he named every single person involved in the plot to remove him. Karen, Thomas, Rachel before she flipped, even the anonymous cops who stood in his backyard with hands on weapons, looking past his humanity. He didn't write with anger. He wrote with purpose. Tasha read the first 3 chapters and burst into tears. "You're not just telling your story," she said. "You're telling all of ours." They self-published the book on a Sunday evening through a digital press. No PR team. No launch party. Just a link and a quiet caption on Brandon's Twitter. "Here's the story. Unfiltered. No edits. No censors. Just truth." Within 12 hours, it shot to 2 on Amazon. By the next morning, it was. Readers flooded the reviews. Students, parents, HOA members, civil servants. Black homeowners wrote about their own versions of Karen. Law students dissected his legal strategy on Reddit forums. Neighborhood groups started holding internal reviews of their own enforcement policies. CNN hosted a roundtable titled, "Prejudice with a Pool Pass: The Brandon Keys Effect." The ACLU updated its public brief to include excerpts from poolside prejudice in their Supreme Court filings. And then, quietly, but unmistakably, politicians took notice. Senator Ava Williams, a progressive lawmaker from Maryland, introduced a new bill, the Keys Fair Housing Act. Its aim? To increase federal oversight of HOA governance, mandate bias audits, and restrict use of fines and citations as a tool for racial exclusion. "This isn't just one neighborhood story," she said on the Senate floor. "This is every zip code where the wrong kind of person buys the right kind of house." Brandon watched the speech from home with Uri beside him, their hands clasped on the couch. She leaned into his shoulder and whispered, "You did it, Daddy." He smiled, but something tugged at him. It wasn't over. Not yet. A few days later, Brandon received a tip from a journalist who had followed his case since the beginning. She sent a link, shaky phone footage from a conservative rally held just outside the city. A crowd of mostly older white attendees waving flags, signs reading "Stop Woke Takeover" and "Protect Suburbia." The camera panned to a makeshift stage. Standing at the podium was Karen Delaney. Gone was the HOA badge and linen pantsuit. Now she wore a red blazer, a pearl necklace, and the defiant smirk of a woman recast. "I was targeted," she declared into the microphone. "I was the victim of a smear campaign. A successful woman dragged through the mud for trying to enforce community standards." The crowd clapped. She continued, her voice rising. "We are not the villains. We are the gatekeepers of values, of decency. And if we don't fight back, there will be no safe neighborhoods left." Brandon watched the clip again and again. It wasn't just delusion. It was strategy. Karen had reinvented herself, turned the scandal into a platform, recast herself as the persecuted patriot. She wasn't hiding. She was gaining traction. Within hours, right-wing media picked up the story. HOA president fired for following rules now speaks out. Meet the woman canceled for calling the cops. Brandon felt his jaw clench. This wasn't over. It had just evolved. That night, Brandon received a FedEx envelope. Inside, a cease and desist letter, not from Karen this time, but from a national political PAC backing her new media campaign. The letter demanded Brandon cease public references and publishing material, or face federal litigation. The envelope sat unopened on Brandon's desk for nearly an hour. It bore the seal of a National Political Action Committee, one that had recently begun surfacing in headlines for pushing back against DEI efforts, rewriting school curricula, and defending traditional American values. Its lead donors? Several wealthy figures tied to media empires and real estate lobbying. Brandon finally sliced it open. Inside was a cease and desist letter on official letterhead, its language as sharp as it was strategic. The message was unmistakable. "You are hereby instructed to cease all public reference to Ms. Karen Delaney and affiliated parties in connection with the publication titled Poolside Prejudice and accompanying media statements. Continued defamation will result in federal litigation under Section 23D protections and civil action for character damage." It was signed by a high-profile law firm with offices in Washington, D.C., the kind of firm used to suing activists into silence. Brandon dropped the letter on the desk, exhaled slowly, and looked out the window. Sunlight bounced off his backyard pool, still and undisturbed. But beneath that glassy surface, war had reawakened. Karen hadn't just regrouped. She had rebranded. She was no longer the embattled HOA villain. She was now the frontwoman of a political movement. And she had powerful allies. The smear campaign began almost immediately. Right-wing news networks ran segments titled, "Woke CEO Weaponizes Racism for Profit." "Cancel Culture in the Cul-de-Sac, the Brandon Keys Hustle." Social media bots flooded Brandon's accounts, calling him a race hustler, grifter, and anti-American. One meme showed Brandon's face photoshopped over a burning American flag. Another labeled him Black Lives Matter's new martyr. But what disturbed him most wasn't the noise. It was the precision. His home address was posted on multiple forums within 48 hours of the pack letter. Photos of his house. Satellite views. Some even included Aries school pickup times. By Friday night, unmarked cars began parking across the street. Engines idling for hours. Windows too tinted to see inside. At first, Brandon told himself it was coincidence. But then came the knocks. Soft, random, always between 1 and 4. At first it was 1, then 2. The final straw came when he spotted a man standing by his front gate at 4:12 a.m. The figure didn't knock, didn't move, just stood there, watching, hood up, hands in his pockets, silent. The man vanished before police could arrive. That morning, Brandon pulled Ari out of school. He brought her to a safe house apartment in Midtown Atlanta, a temporary space with round-the-clock security and private entrance. She didn't cry. She didn't ask questions. She just looked at him and said, "Is this because we told the truth?" Brandon held her close and whispered, "Yes, but that doesn't mean we stop." By day, he carried on. By night, he watched the cameras. The online attacks escalated. His company's Yelp page was flooded with one-star reviews, calling it a Marxist front. His LinkedIn inbox filled with hate mail, disguised as feedback. Fake allegations of misusing investor funds began to circulate, crafted with just enough detail to unsettle. But Brandon refused to blink. He updated Bias Beacon to include a harassment reporting module. He released another public statement. Silencing is a strategy. It only works when we choose comfort over accountability. Donations surged again. Civil rights groups created a defense fund for him, and others being targeted for HOA whistleblowing. His face was now a fixture on morning shows, podcast interviews, TikTok clips dissecting every twist of the story, but it also made him a bigger target. One evening, he returned home from an advocacy panel to find his garage door spray-painted with the words, "Stop woke lies." Security footage showed 2 masked individuals fleeing the scene, too fast to trace. Still, Brandon didn't leave. He reinforced the doors, replaced his mailbox with a bulletproof model, upgraded to armored glass on the front windows. And then, on a quiet Sunday night, it happened. 2:03 a.m. Security alarms erupted like war drums. Brandon bolted from bed, heart thundering. He checked the monitors. Smoke. Flames. The mailbox. Engulfed. A camera caught the flash. A Molotov cocktail arcing through the darkness like a cursed comet. It hit the ground just feet from the mailbox. Fire blooming on impact. The flames licked up the wooden gate, scorching the hedges and blackening the concrete. Within minutes, the fire department was there. The blaze was contained. No injuries, no home damage. But the message had been delivered. It wasn't about destruction. It was about fear. About escalation. The next morning, photos of the charred mailbox went viral. Again, Brandon stood by it, jaw tight, holding a singed piece of Ari's forgotten chalk art, a pastel lion, its mane half burned. A reporter asked him, "Are you scared now?" Brandon didn't hesitate. "No, I'm angry." He stared directly into the camera. "They want to silence me with fire because words didn't work. But I'm still here. My daughter's still here. And we're not going anywhere." That same afternoon, Brandon received a call from his lawyer, Melissa. Her voice trembled. "We have a problem. The opposing legal team just filed a motion. They claim you violated the HOA bylaws with the book. If the court agrees, they could use it to strip your ownership and force the sale of your home." The scorched outline of the Molotov's blast was still visible when the crime scene team arrived. Charred wood, melted plastic, a chemical tang that lingered in the morning air like hatred crystallized into scent. Brandon stood behind the yellow tape, arms crossed, jaw set. The investigator crouched beside the blackened remains of the mailbox, carefully lifting what was left of the glass bottle from a crater in the concrete. "This wasn't a prank," the officer muttered. "This was intentional. Accelerant-based, probably homemade." Another investigator, Detective Randall, a quiet, meticulous black woman in her 40s, approached Brandon directly. "We're classifying this as a hate crime," she said. "The threat level combined with your profile, the timing after public harassment, and the messages, it fits the statute." Brandon nodded, but there was no relief in his expression. "This wasn't just meant to scare me," he said. "It was meant to punish me for speaking." Randall met his gaze. "Steady. They chose the wrong man." Within 24 hours, the arson made national news. Molotov attack on black CEO's home ruled hate crime. No arrests yet. Cameras circled the street. Activists camped nearby with signs reading, "We won't be burned silent." But Brandon's mind was already on the next battle. He took the fight to City Hall. At a scheduled community oversight hearing, he testified under oath, addressing not just the attack, but the pattern that led to it. The HOA citations, the silent neighbors, the police bias, the pack harassment, the lawsuit threats. The room was full. Journalists, community leaders, parents, students. Ari sat in the front row beside Tasha, her small hands folded tightly in her lap. Brandon wore no suit that day. Just a black button-up shirt and truth. When asked how the experience had changed him, Brandon paused, his breath caught, his eyes glassed. Then his voice cracked. "My daughter had to be relocated because of the color of her skin," he said. "She drew a chalk lion on our driveway and watched it get burned in a fire meant for her father. She asked if telling the truth meant you had to run. How do I answer that?" The room went silent. For a full 7 seconds, nothing but the hum of old light fixtures filled the air. He continued, "I built a tech company from nothing. I paid my taxes, donated to the police department that profiled me, and still, I had to prove I belonged in my own backyard." He looked toward the council. "This isn't about pools or bylaws. It's about the price we put on presence. And for black families in white neighborhoods, that price is everything." The footage went viral within hours. It was clipped, memed, subtitled. TikTok turned it into anthem-style edits. Instagram was flooded with reels captioned, "My child had to hide because of her skin." The city responded. A solidarity march was organized, almost overnight. On a gray Sunday morning, over 6,000 people, from neighboring suburbs, local colleges, downtown churches, and quiet cul-de-sacs, flooded Willow Bend. They carried signs, "Justice isn't HOA optional. We belong everywhere. Accountability is patriotic." Ari marched too, holding Brandon's hand. She wore a black hoodie with a golden lion stitched onto the chest. At the end of the march, Brandon stood on the same patch of sidewalk where he had once been handcuffed in swim trunks, and spoke again. "No matter how loud they get," he said, voice unwavering, "they cannot drown out truth." Under that pressure, legal, social, and moral, the HOA had no place left to hide. Within 2 weeks, the remaining board members submitted their resignations. A new board was voted in. It looked nothing like the last. 3 black residents, 1 Latina mother, a gay veteran, an Asian American tech consultant. The first truly diverse HOA in Willow Bend's 42-year history. Their first action? Passing the community equity policy into permanent HOA bylaws, with full transparency requirements, anti-discrimination clauses, and third-party bias review audits. The news cycle hailed it as a suburban civil rights transformation. Brandon didn't celebrate with champagne. He celebrated by finally bringing Ari back home. They painted the mailbox together. Fireproof metal now, but topped with a tiny bronze lion. Still, one war had ended. Another loomed. Brandon's legal team was finalizing trial prep for the civil rights lawsuit against the HOA and Atlanta PD. Witnesses had been deposed. The surveillance footage, authenticated. Audio files verified. Expert witnesses lined up. Then the message arrived. A short email from the judge's clerk. Court date set, September 12th, Fulton County. Civil Rights Division. Brandon stared at the line for a long time. This wouldn't just be a trial. It had the potential to redefine the limits of HOA power nationwide and establish precedent for racial discrimination enforcement standards in private neighborhoods. If they won, it could shift the housing landscape permanently. It could reshape America's most segregated modern gatekeepers, homeowners associations. Tasha called that evening. "It's on the calendar," she said. Brandon's voice was steady. "Then so is history." Minutes later, Brandon received a private message from a journalist source. "Just got access to internal police memos you haven't seen. There was a coordinated strategy to discredit you, ordered from above." Attached was a single sentence from one memo. "Keys is gaining sympathy. Time to control the narrative." The courthouse stood like a fortress of cold limestone and older truths that had for generations protected some and crushed others. But this time, the story walking through its doors was different. Brandon stepped inside Fulton County Superior Court, flanked by his attorneys and 2 security personnel. He wore a gray suit, understated but sharp, and held Ari's lion keychain, in his hand like a talisman. It didn't jingle. It whispered strength. Reporters lined the steps. Protesters circled the sidewalk. Signs read, HOA Nice Supreme Court. Your rules don't erase our rights, and let black belonging be law. Inside the courtroom, rows filled quickly. Press, civil rights observers, law students scribbling into legal pads. The tension was heavy, like pre-thunder humidity. The trial of Keys v. Willow Bend HOA and City of Atlanta police had officially begun. Opening statements were crisp, strategic. Brandon's team painted the story not as a one-off trespassing mistake, but as a systemic pattern of racist policy and weaponized silence. They laid out the citations, the chat logs, the surveillance footage, the failed protections. They showed bias made bureaucratic. The defense pushed back, claiming Brandon had inflamed tensions, had used media to vilify procedural enforcement, and was profiting off division. But everything changed when Brandon took the stand. He spoke slowly, calmly, not for sympathy, but for truth. I didn't want this, he began. All I wanted was to swim in peace, to raise my daughter without explaining why her father was seen as a threat. He paused. The courtroom leaned forward. I've donated to this city. I've hired dozens from underserved communities. I've sat through countless board meetings trying to fix the tech systems that now track us more than they protect us. And yet, the moment I stepped into a space people didn't think I should own, they tried to erase me. Dude. He explained the citations, the emails, the mailbox fire, the pain, the surveillance, the fact that Ari still asked to keep the blinds closed, even during the day. When asked what the worst part was, his voice faltered. It wasn't the money, or the humiliation. It was my daughter looking at me and asking if being black meant always apologizing just for being there. The courtroom was silent. Even the stenographer's fingers slowed. Then came Karen. Her attorney had carefully prepared her. Reframe the incident as a safety concern. Lean into misunderstood intentions. Emphasize community preservation. But her voice cracked before she even reached the second sentence. Under cross-examination, the defense crumbled. Brandon's lawyer, Melissa, was relentless but poised. Ms. Delaney, did you file the original 911 report? Yes, Karen admitted. But it wasn't because he was black. It was because I didn't recognize him. Melissa displayed an image of Brandon at the HOA spring mixer, standing with Karen shaking her hand. You mean you didn't recognize this man, in a neighborhood you oversee, after attending a mixer where you were formally introduced? Karen stammered. And were you part of the WhatsApp group, WB Watchdog Coalition? Yes, but I didn't create it. Yet your name appears in nearly half the messages, including the one that says he doesn't belong here. Let's make him want to leave. Karen looked down. And who installed unauthorized surveillance devices behind Mr. Key's property line? I didn't. We have Zoom audio, Ms. Delaney. Your voice. I want all motion data streamed. If he's hosting meetings, I want to know. The silence that followed was absolute. Karen sat back, pale, the illusion of her innocence torn apart by her own echoes. 2 days later, after closing arguments, the jury deliberated for just under 5 hours. When they returned, the courtroom stood still. The foreperson, a middle-aged Latina woman with resolute eyes, read the verdict aloud. We, the jury, find in favor of the plaintiff, Mr. Brandon Keys. We find the Willow Bend Homeowners Association liable for civil rights violations, racial harassment, and abuse of governance. We find the Atlanta Police Department liable for unlawful detainment and violation of constitutional protections. We award damages in the amount of $7,600,000. Gasps broke out. Some cried. Some clapped before being hushed by the judge. Brandon sat still for a moment, blinking once, not from disbelief, but from the magnitude of the moment. His hand gripped the lion keychain tighter. Justice, for once, had arrived not as a theory, but as a ruling. The ruling sent shockwaves across the country. By noon it trended globally. Keys. Not host to justice by the pool. Civil rights leaders called it historic. HOA organizations scrambled to review their policies. Police departments began quietly issuing memos on bias response and public interaction guidelines. But perhaps most striking was what followed on the ground. In over 60 cities, residents of gated communities, Black, Latino, Asian American, and even white allies, began holding belonging block parties, symbolic community protests celebrating multicultural presence in historically exclusive neighborhoods. A viral video in Portland showed a Vietnamese-American family jumping into their pool with a giant inflatable sign, "We're staying too." In Philadelphia, residents stood outside their HOA headquarters singing Sam Cooke's "A Change Is Gonna Come." And in Atlanta, another mural appeared. This one stretched across a freeway underpass. Brandon, Ari, and the lion, staring forward beneath the words, "Truth isn't trespassing." In the midst of it all, Brandon received a formal letter from the U.S. House Committee on Housing and Urban Development. He was invited to testify before Congress. The topic: racial bias and abuse in homeowners associations. It was scheduled for the next month. Brandon stared at the letter. It felt less like recognition and more like responsibility. Tasha called almost immediately after. "You've made history, B," she said. "Now they want you to help rewrite it." He smiled softly, letting the words settle. But just as the celebration began to settle into resolve, Melissa forwarded him the new file, the internal police memo. The header read, "Community Influence Management Plan. Target, Brandon Key." At the bottom of the memo, a single line stood out, bolded and underlined: "Engage federal agencies if narrative control fails." The Capitol rotunda echoed with quiet power. Marble columns rose like monuments to promises long unkept. On this day, beneath those vaulted ceilings, the story of a man once mistaken for a trespasser would finally be entered into the permanent record of the United States. Brandon Keyes adjusted his navy blue tie and took his seat behind the microphone. The congressional hearing chamber buzzed with anticipation, aides hustling, journalists setting up tripods, lawmakers flipping through packets that bore his name. Brandon Keyes, CEO of Nextdyne Technologies, testimony on HOA abuse and housing discrimination. He glanced down the table. Activists, legal scholars, neighborhood association reps. And there, in the front row of the gallery, Ari, her curls braided, her cheeks bright with silent pride, sat between Tasha and Brandon's brother, Malcolm. The chairwoman gavelled the hearing into session. "Mr. Keyes, you may begin your testimony." Brandon leaned forward. The moment felt too big to script. "I come before you not as a victim," he began, his voice smooth but heavy, "but as a witness to what happens when racism wears a sweater vest, when it hides behind neighborhood rules, garden height limits, and concerned citizen calls." He paused, letting the silence hang. "They didn't burn a cross on my lawn. They used bylaws. Citations. And when those failed, fire." Gasps rippled through the gallery. "I built a company to track threats in real time, but I couldn't build one fast enough to track the hate that lived on my block." He told the story, not just of the pool, or the arrest, or the lawsuit, but of Ari, of her note in the backpack, of the chalk lion burned by fire, of the silence of neighbors, of the sound of his own heartbeat. The moment the taser was drawn. "And still," Brandon said, "we stay." He concluded with a message that left the room breathless. "I'm not here asking for sympathy. I'm asking for structure. Law must catch up with culture. Because right now it's legal to be racist, as long as you're polite about it." As Brandon stepped down, applause broke the chamber's protocol. Clips of his testimony hit social media within minutes. Soundbites turned to TikTok trends. "Racism in a sweater vest" became a hashtag. His quote, "Legal to be racist as long as you're polite," was printed on protest signs from Oakland to Atlanta. Within 2 months, a coalition of senators introduced the Keyes Fair Housing Equity Act. It proposed mandatory federal bias audits for HOAs, legal limitations on vague citations and discretionary fines, protections for residents who report racial bias in housing associations, funding for a public housing discrimination hotline with DOJ oversight. Hearings ran for weeks. Debates were fierce, but the voices were louder. Dozens of black homeowners testified about arbitrary fines, surveillance, intimidation. Latinx residents spoke of being welcomed until they painted their doors the wrong color. LGBTQ families spoke of concerned neighbor emails, citing their flags. Finally, the bill passed. The Keyes Act signed into law, with Brandon and Ari, at the White House lawn, was the first major federal reform of private housing governance in over 40 years. That night, Brandon stood by the reflecting pool in D.C., watching the lights shimmer. Ari hugged his waist. "We did it, Daddy." He kissed her forehead. "You did it. You gave me a reason not to run." A month later, back in Atlanta, life began to feel like life again. The Nextdyne offices reopened stronger than ever. The company's stock climbed, and Brandon surprised his team by announcing profit-sharing plans for junior employees and a new DEI incubator fund. But it wasn't the numbers that marked victory. It was the ordinary. One crisp Saturday morning, Brandon walked outside with a towel slung over his shoulder, and Ari skipping at his side. They approached the pool, the same infinity pool that once marked the epicenter of humiliation. Now, it held nothing but sunlight and peace. Brandon turned to Ari. First one in, she grinned. Bet. She dove. He followed. Water rose in arcs around them like freedom being splashed.
No sirens, no stairs, no fear.
Only home. Later that evening, after Ari had gone to bed, Brandon sat on the back steps drying his feet. He looked out toward the mural across from their house, the one painted by local artists during the marches. It once read, "Still we rise." Now someone had added a fresh phrase beneath it. In gold, bold letters. He turned the tables. Brandon exhaled. The kind of exhale that comes after holding your breath for years. The kind of exhale that says, "I'm still here." The next morning, Ari stood at the school assembly podium in front of her classmates, her voice confident, rehearsed but warm. "My name is Ari Keys. And my dad taught me what courage looks like. Not loud, not mean, but showing up even when people want you gone. I watched him stand up when everyone else sat down." She paused, then smiled. "And now I know what kind of hero I want to be." The applause echoed through the auditorium. The teacher cried. Brandon cried. Ori didn't, she was too busy bowing. That evening, Brandon received an invitation to speak at a global conference on racial equity and housing innovation. He declined. For now, he just wanted to stay still. Be present. Water his backyard. Cook breakfast. And maybe, just maybe, stop proving anything to anyone. But the world wasn't done with him. The story, it seemed, had one last question to ask. A moving truck pulled into the house next door. Brandon watched from the porch, sipping coffee. A black man stepped out with a clipboard. Behind him, a woman, 2 kids, and a dog. Brandon smiled. But his smile slowly faded when he saw the familiar shape of a neighbor watching from the corner house. Arms crossed, eyes narrowed. He put down his coffee. But what happens when another black man moves in next door? They tried to erase him with silence, with paperwork, with fire. But he stood anyway, because some truths don't back down. If you've ever felt the weight of not being welcomed, where you belong, if you believe no one should have to prove their worth to feel safe at home, type yes if you believe in justice. Subscribe if this broke your heart,